The year is 1886. The Seventh-day Adventist Church has been organized for more than 20 years, but it has not yet so much as touched the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Not a single church or school or clinic, no literature being distributed or community service, and the same is true pretty much of all of the nation's large cities. So to change that, city missions were established in several of these cities, including the Washington, D.C. mission. Now, the D.C. mission was just a rented row house with no more than a half a dozen or so workers, most of them young people, taking on the nation's capital city. Especially at first, progress was very difficult. So the spirits of one of the workers, 20-year-old Georgia Harper, must have lifted on the day in 1887 when an exceptionally genial, professionally attired young black man responded positively to the literature she offered. Yet she could in no way have imagined the far-reaching consequences. That when this young man, Dr. James H. Howard, accepted the Adventist message, it would be the opening of a large portal to the black population of Washington, at that time the largest of any city in America. Nor could anyone have imagined that it would lead to a dramatic showdown in the nation's capital over the present truth of Adventism and America's original sin, racism. It's also difficult to imagine Adventism finding a more winsome and well-positioned ambassador to Black Washington than James H. Howard. He graduated from Howard University at age 18, the youngest person to earn a bachelor's degree from the university for many decades to come, and on top of that, he was class valedictorian. And then he went on to earn an MA and also an MD at Howard Medical School in 1883, again at the top of his class. Instead of practicing medicine, though, Dr. Howard attained a relatively prestigious position in federal government service. When he encountered Georgia Harper and Adventism in 1887, he was in his mid-20s, and he had just stepped into a future bright with promise for success, financial comfort, and status among the black elite of Washington society. Dr. Kelly Miller, prominent Howard University professor and public intellectual, he wrote that James Howard's embrace of Adventism created a sensation among the faculty, student body, and alumni. Dr. Howard became a marked man among his erstwhile friends and admirers who shook their heads at what they regarded as the folly of so promising a young man needlessly throwing away his career. The first black person in Washington, D.C., for that matter, among the first few of any race to embrace Adventism, Dr. Howard was unsurpassed, and he was irrepressible in his enthusiasm for telling others about the truth he had found and the loving community he now experienced. He and his wife, Belle, were among the interracial group of 26 believers who organized the first Adventist church in Washington in 1889. Of his earliest experiences witnessing to his newfound faith, he said,
"One of the first questions asked me is, are your people as hypocritical as the rest of the churches on the race question?"
And then he went on to say that he had been able to give an emphatic no in response because
"I have had so much confidence in our church and their faithfulness to the principles of Christ."
See, Dr. Howard was excited about Adventism because he thought that in it he had found not just another denomination in which the Reformation had stalled and then rigidified, but a movement that followed the advancing light of present truth, radically committed to recovering and following the way of the gospel, no matter how unpopular or costly it may be. And that, he believed, was the antidote to America's original sin, to the racism that poisoned and sickened American society. And he gave this warning:
"If we compromise with this worldly hatred that Americans call prejudice, while professing to have the love of Christ in our hearts, to have the purest light of the gospel, to be looking for the early advent of the Savior, and to be keeping the commandments, they would consider us the most pronounced hypocrites of all professing Christians."
The Washington Church grew to 150 members over the next 10 years, about 50 of whom were black. and all shared equal participation in fellowship regardless of race. Among them was Rosetta Douglas Sprague, daughter of Frederick Douglass, and she was a powerful advocate of justice and equality in her own right. Revivalist A.F. Ballinger, who ministered to the congregation in 1899, declared,
"This church is a living miracle of the power of God, composed as it is of the two races. The harmony which prevails is a great surprise to the members of other churches."
So, amazingly enough, the antidote seemed to be working. In this congregation, members of both races were convinced that racial harmony and equality had to be present wherever the gospel was believed and acted upon. And in American society at the turn of the 20th century, that was about as countercultural as you could get. And it was already beginning to attract attention when, in 1902, that witness was dramatically amplified. A look at the newspapers of the day gives us a sense for what happened.
Extra, extra, a new faith comes. No color line in the local Adventist church. Extra, extra, Negro minister draws thousands to his tent. Extra, extra.
The Colored American reported that Sheaf's meetings are nightly crowded by the best citizens of the district of every faith and of both races, who flock to hear his convincing, logical, and matchless eloquence. Somehow this eloquent evangelist, a Baptist before accepting the Adventist message in 1896, connected with Washington, D.C. in this time of deteriorating racial conditions. Somehow his preaching compelled an interest that, at least for a moment, dissolved the color line. Members of Congress, according to one account, were among those best citizens mentioned in the newspaper. They would hurry down from Capitol Hill to catch the evening meetings at Sheaf's tent. A breathtaking opportunity lay wide open for Adventists to make known in this venue of unparalleled influence their message about the culmination of God's plan to restore lost humanity, and thereby to take the lead in demonstrating the power of that restoration to overcome the sin of racism so deeply embedded in both individual hearts and in the fabric of society. But the moment of opportunity also swiftly became a time of crisis. With the Washington church already overcrowded in its house of worship, Adventist denominational leaders preconceived a plan to establish a second congregation after the evangelistic thrust of 1902, and they became wedded to the assumption that the two congregations would have to be racially defined, one white, one black, and they insisted on executing the plan even though half of the white and all of the black members of the original congregation opposed it. And so the church was divided, and it was divided at the very time when Sheaf's evangelism had drawn the attention, favorable attention of Washington, D.C. to Adventism as never before. A time when, as Dr. Howard put it, the world was watching and wondering to see just where the Adventists will stand now on this question at the national capital and elsewhere. Denominational leaders, however, were convinced that the success of the church's mission required accommodating, going along with the world's worsening pattern of race relations. James Howard, the D.C. doctor who discovered Adventism to be an antidote for the disease of racism, pled with A.G. Daniels, the General Conference president, for the application of it in the nation's capital. He pled for an evangelistic approach that would be sensitive to the initial reservations of both racial groups, but would then teach racial equality as part of what it means to be an Adventist.
I tell you plainly, Brother Daniels, with all respect, that you and your committee are grievously wrong in your course and policy on the race question. And you are wrong at a time when the world is growing worse in this respect and so much need your wise and corrective influence.
So Dr. Howard was disappointed No, really, he was devastated that the church he had come to love failed to apply its own medicine, lacked the courage to step through doors dramatically opened by God's providence. Yet, this man who was so far ahead of his time was also wise enough to realize that it was men who had failed, not the message. And he never gave up on it. He didn't even really lose his enthusiasm for more than a moment. And because of that, his witness lives on and speaks powerfully to us today. Our nation still needs the antidote for its original sin, even more than it does for COVID-19. The antidote exists. Dr. Howard saw it clearly a century ago. But that's not enough, just as it's not enough for the COVID vaccine to sit in its super cold freezers. Like the antidote-producing vaccine, the antidote to America's original sin has to be explained, distributed, and applied. May God, in His mercy, forgive us for our past failures, and in His loving power, make us agents of His healing grace to a nation still ailing and corrupted by its original sin.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall
We shall